whom this would not be possible: Bristol Myers Squibb, Amgen Oncology, Karyopharm Therapeutics, AbbVie, Adaptive Biotechnologies, Genentech, Oncopeptides, and Takeda Oncology. So today's topic is going to be the neutropenic diet. And earlier this year, when we sent a survey to chapter members asking them what topics would you be interested in learning about within the stem cell transplant chapter, one of the most common voted on topics was, what kind of diet should I follow after stem cell transplant? I feel like there's a lot of differing versions of the neutropenic diet, which Katie's going to hit on later today. So when I contacted Katie, who is a registered dietitian that also works for HealthTree, about speaking on this topic, she surprised me even more by sharing recent studies that challenged what I originally believed about the diet being necessary. I'm going to let her explain all of that, but I really do believe she is the perfect person to speak to us today, and I'm really excited for you to hear her presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce you. She's going to do a brief introduction of herself, but Katie Braswell joined the HealthTree Foundation as the Community Director for AML in 2021. She's a registered dietitian who previously worked at the VA hospital in Dallas, Texas, where she coached veterans with blood cancer and their caregivers on how to use nutrition to improve their treatment outcomes and minimize cancer-related side effects. Katie is passionate about health education and patient empowerment. She believes that food is foundational to cultivating a life of health and happiness. So Katie, thank you for joining us today, and the time is now yours.
Thanks, Audrey. Wow, we have quite the group today, quite a lot of you. I'm so happy to be here with everyone today, and especially to be talking about something I'm so passionate about, which is nutrition. So happy for the invite and happy to be here with all of you. I'm going to talk about the neutropenic diet today. I have some objectives. We'll go over that in a second. But as Audrey said, it might be a little bit different than what you're expecting today. So I'm happy to dive in with all of you. A little bit about me. I am a registered dietitian. I have a master's degree in clinical nutrition. I did work at the VA hospital in Dallas before coming to HealthTree in January of this year. So I'm pretty new to the foundation, but I am essentially Audrey's counterpart. I'm just working on a different blood cancer, which is acute myeloid leukemia. We're replicating all of these amazing myeloma programs you heard about in the intro video and probably are a part of already, and offering them to patients just with a different blood cancer. So we're happy to help more and more people. At the VA, I specialized in oncology or cancer nutrition. So I did work a lot with veterans and their caregivers on using nutrition to their benefit before, during, and after treatment. So cancer nutrition is something I'm passionate about. My grandfather had myeloma, so I'm especially connected to the myeloma patients and helping them with their nutrition. Fun facts about me: I love a good shot of espresso. I'm a former college soccer player. I am getting in the garden a lot lately, and excited to get my luggage back out as the world opens back up. So today, here are our objectives. We're going to talk and define neutropenia, and talk about what the neutropenic diet is. Talk maybe about shifting our perspective a little bit from a restrictive diet after transplant to more of focus on food safety. We'll talk about why that is. I'm going to go through some of my top food safety tips to get you thinking, and then we'll go through the different food categories at the end and talk a little bit about what foods are fine after a transplant and which ones we should be more mindful of to help reduce our infection risk. Oh, my picture didn't show up. Oh, there it is. Okay, so you're going to hear the word neutropenic diet a lot, so we need to define what neutropenia is first. And so I have a little photo here. I felt like this was best to help grasp the concept, but We have stem cells that are made in our bone marrow, and they can ultimately end up as different types of cells. The main categories here are our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and our platelets. And so we have lots of different types of white blood cells, and neutrophils are one of those types of white blood cells. Ultimately, they help us to fight off bacterial and fungal infections. And so the term neutropenia means that we are low in neutrophils. And this usually occurs from treatments like chemotherapy and stem cell transplant. So neutropenia falls on a spectrum. We can have mild, moderate, or severe neutropenia depending on what our ANC is, our absolute neutrophil count. And that's usually found on blood work that your doctor's running. So depending where your ANC falls, you can fall in mild, moderate, or severe category. And it really depends on where you are in your treatment and your transplant protocol. The process before transplant will put you in the severe category. And so hopefully over time, as you are healing from the transplant and recovering, your A1C is coming up and should hopefully be at least 500 by 30 days post-transplant. So why do we need to talk about food when it comes to having neutropenia? And so because our neutrophils are low and we're unable to fight off these microorganisms, these invaders, we'll call them, the bad bugs, food matters. So we can eat food that could potentially harbor some of these bad bugs. And so we want to be able to be mindful of what we consume, but not necessarily scared of what we consume. Hopefully throughout the presentation, we'll ease your minds a little bit. But that's one of the reasons. The second reason is that the chemotherapy and potentially radiation that you receive prior to your transplant does a lot of damage to your gut lining. And so if we potentially eat something that harbors a bad bacteria, let's say, it's more likely to be more severe. One, because you can't fight it off as well. And two, because it has the potential to migrate from your GI tract into your bloodstream because of the potentially damaged lining that you may have. And that's when things become more severe and potentially life-threatening. And we call this condition sepsis, if you've maybe heard that term before. So that's certainly something we want to be mindful of. The reason food could potentially harbor these bacteria is not because the food naturally contains it. It's generally due to poor handling practices, poor storage practices, poor hygiene potentially, or we're maybe not cooking it all the way through. We're choosing products that have been not pasteurized or processed in a way that's helpful to reduce the bacterial load. So hopefully you'll take away from this that with good food safety practices, our risk of becoming ill from a food, whether we're neutropenic or not, can be greatly reduced if we take proper precautions. So because of this idea and these two reasons I shared of the connection between food and neutropenia, the neutropenic diet was introduced. And you'll hear this diet referred to by a lot of different names depending on where you are. So you might hear sterile diet, low microbial diet, low bacterial diet, probably a lot of other ones floating around out there. But it all essentially means restriction to help reduce the bacteria that you're consuming. It's a theory. It's based on a theory, and we'll talk about why I use the word theory in a second. But people who are placed on a neutropenic diet are typically people who have those lower ANCs, usually less than 1,000, who are receiving chemotherapy, potentially depending on where you are receiving treatment and their viewpoints on the neutropenic diet, and if you're receiving stem cell transplant. It's important to note that a standardized neutropenic diet has never been developed. So it looks different all across the nation, all across the world, depending on where you are. If your institution recommends a neutropenic diet, what's in that diet and what's allowed and what's not is going to look really different at another institution. So it's important to keep that in mind. Because there's never been a standardized version, there's lots of different interpretations. So some examples of what we've seen over the years. The most severe, and hopefully the one that you'll never see again and that they're not doing anymore, would be making foods completely sterile through canning, autoclaving, irradiation, putting foods in these machines to completely kill all of the microbes in them. I'm hoping you won't see that. Super old school. Well-cooked foods only, you might see that one. So killing off the bacteria, off the microorganisms with heat. So only eating foods that are cooked really, really thoroughly and heavy. Or you might see a regular diet that omits all fresh fruit and vegetables. So there's lots of different things you may see, but the common themes among neutropenic diets are that they're extremely restrictive at most places, if they're not kind of up to date on the research that I'll be sharing. So they'll be completely void of all fresh fruits and vegetables, all juices, all dairy, probably, honey, eggs, cheese. You can see by the list that a lot of foods are taken off the table in some of these diets you may see. So overall, it's restrictive, and restrictive equals low in nutrients, and nutrients that are especially useful for helping our immune system to function and helping us to recover from the transplant process and really promote healing. So let's take a look at what the evidence says. So I'd like to share that the usefulness of a neutropenic diet has never been scientifically proven. And so that's why earlier I called it more of a theory. There were some early studies when the diet was first introduced in the 60s and 70s. During that time, patients with cancer were having really, really high rates of infection and dying really rapidly from it. So they created this experiment where they kind of put people in a bubble and created this extremely sterile environment. And food was one of those pieces that became sterile and became protected. And because this entire bubble idea was helpful in reducing rates of infection and deaths, they kind of adopted the neutropenic diet, this sterile type of diet, without testing it individually. They kind of lumped all of the factors together and kind of assumed that they all needed to be implemented. So we never really got a sense if the neutropenic diet alone helped to reduce rates of infection, because it was always lumped in with other things. It's also important to note that the neutropenic diet is not supported by really important organizations in our country. So the CDC, the FDA, the American Cancer Society, and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics do not recommend a neutropenic diet to be followed after stem cell transplant. I pulled a study that I thought was interesting to share to give you an idea of one of the results we have on a neutropenic diet. Here they took 726 stem cell transplant recipients. Half of them got a neutropenic diet. The other half got a general regular diet. The study found, interestingly enough, that there were significantly fewer infections in the patients that received a general diet versus the neutropenic diet. And I wanted to point out here that the majority of the people that were studied in this cohort received autologous transplants and not allogeneic transplants. So this was really interesting, and it falls in line with some of the other studies, with what some of the other studies have found. Several have found lower infection rates among those on general diets when compared to neutropenic diets. But many more studies, the more handful of studies have found that there are no difference in infection rates when you compare neutropenic to general diets after transplant. So it's important to think about why this may be. Why do people do better on general diets and not a neutropenic diet when it sounds so good in theory? You consume you consume products that have less bacteria overall. So why don't those people do better and have less infections? We know from a nutrition standpoint that the more restrictive a diet is, the higher risk you have for malnutrition and infection. And so a stem cell transplant puts you at extremely high nutrition risk. Just the process alone makes us as dietitians want to watch you at like a hawk. We pay really close attention to our transplant recipients because we know this as a fact, because there's a lot of side effects that come into play. A lot of gastrointestinal changes, poor appetite, food aversion, just not feeling like eating. And those result in things like malnutrition and impaired immunity. So if we restrict diet on top of a really high risk procedure nutritionally, those things don't go hand in hand. We also know that a diet low in fresh fruit and vegetable, which is one of the main things that neutropenic diets restrict, makes your diet low in vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, which are super important for the healing process and for our immune system. It's also going to be low in fiber, which could potentially change the environment of your gastrointestinal system. We want it to be populated with all of this good bacteria. And if you're restricting fruit and vegetable and fiber and a lot of other foods, then that allows for more of the bad bacteria to colonize. And that, in theory, I haven't found where it's been proven, but in theory could potentially be why some of these people fare worse on more restrictive diets. So let's look at what the organizations say. So the CDC puts out some recommendations for how you can reduce your risk of infection. I bolded the ones that are nutrition related. And on here, you'll see some recommendations, but you won't see any restrictions, and you won't see them telling you to avoid any full food groups. So they're telling you to not share food, not share drinks, not share utensils. So keep those personal to yourself. It's telling you to cook your meat and eggs thoroughly, not to avoid them. And it's telling you to thoroughly wash your fruits and vegetables, but also, again, not to avoid them. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, so this is the governing organization over all dietitians like myself. Their statement here says that dietitians should be educating patients on safe food handling practices, and explicitly says that a neutropenic diet is not necessary. And so the Oncology Nursing Society puts out quite a lengthy statement here saying that there are no newer studies that show that a neutropenic diet helps reduce risk of infection, but they do say that you should be following the USDA's food safety guidelines and list some of the important ones here for you. I'll go through these in a bit more detail, but it's important to note that there's no recommendation from them for the restriction of fresh fruit or vegetables either. So this information might put you kind of at a crossroads. It's kind of a balancing act. So like on one side, you have the research that I shared, the important highly reputable organizations not endorsing a neutropenic diet. You have this desire to follow a diet that's not restrictive. We don't want to pull things away from our diet if we don't have to, especially after going through something like transplant. It's just one extra thing to worry about. It's one extra thing to plan for. And we also want a diet that we can adhere to. Restriction is hard, especially with everything else you might have going on. So you have this side, but you also have the other side. You have the side where institutions are still promoting a pretty strict neutropenic diet, depending on where you are. You have what your doctor tells you, and nobody really likes to go against that. Sometimes healthcare professionals aren't up to date on the most recent findings and things, and that's no fault of their own. There's a lot to keep up with, a lot changes, but maybe they haven't read the most recent recommendations. It's really hard to change things in medicine and get people to change their mindset and to change practices. You also have this safe than sorry mindset. You have people that would rather restrict things to be on the safe side, and you can't blame people for that either. Infection is real and serious, and we don't want that. So some people would rather err on the side of caution. And you also have what research doesn't tell you. So we do have studies, we have a handful of them, but nutrition research is hard, and we maybe haven't exhausted everything in terms of our study efforts to find out all that we need to know about nutrition and infection and neutropenia. So it's kind of this balancing act, and what you'll find is that most people, most institutions will meet in the middle. You'll still find these neutropenic diets, but hopefully they've been modified or adapted to be less restrictive based on the research that we have, and be a bit more focused on food safety versus cutting out full food groups. So while the neutropenic diet isn't necessary, proper food safety is. So how food is processed, handled, prepared, and stored are the most important things you can do for yourself to reduce your risk of infection. The USDA, the FDA, foodsafety.gov have some really great resources. I would encourage you to go online and check out their pages on food safety. If this is a concept that's newer to you, or if you want to brush up and learn a bit more in depth, the USDA puts out this nice framework, this 4-step framework you see on the left to really simplify things for you and make it not feel so overwhelming. But you'll find that on their website there. So let's kind of go through the steps in terms of food safety. So as I go through these, you might think, well, duh. A lot of this is stuff you should already be doing, transplant or not. Like, we all should follow proper food safety protocols for the most part. But this is a crucial time here that we want to be extra diligent about paying attention to these things and making sure we really understand them before going into transplant. So it starts with what you bring home. Grocery shopping is important in terms of what you pay attention to and what you choose to buy. So you always want to check for expiration dates. Never do anything past the expiration. Never bring it home. Never eat it past the expiration date. So looking at those is a really important thing as you move through the store. You want to buy fruits and vegetables that are pristine, that don't have, scrapes, bruises, definitely not molds. You want them to look pretty and good. You don't want to buy the pre-cut stuff. So like a pre-cut melon in the little container they sell in the refrigerated section of the produce area. You don't want to do that, not because the melon itself is bad, but because it's been exposed to more hands than it has to be. So the more exposure to other people a food has, the more risk it has in terms of maybe they didn't wash their hands properly. Maybe they didn't, maybe they came to work sick that day. You don't know. So you want to take the fresh produce home and process it or cut it up yourself instead. You don't want to buy cans that are dented. You don't want to buy jars or glass that's broken. You don't want to buy things that aren't properly sealed. Those should be givens. When it comes to your dairy, honey, and juices, you want to buy pasteurized. We'll talk more about that towards the end, so we'll come back to that. You want to buy eggs that are refrigerated. You don't want to buy from the communal bins. We have the bulk section, the aisle. We don't want to really buy because from those bins because people have touched. Again, we're trying to avoid multiple people being around that food. You don't want to take the free samples. Again, exposure. You don't want to buy from the deli because of exposure. More hands, more people breathing around it. You don't want to buy from the hot deli or the salad bar. I know grocery stores have really great hot and salad offerings these days. You don't really want to buy from there. It's important to separate your meat and your ready-to-eat foods in your buggy, in your grocery cart. So keep meat on one side and keep your non-cooked things on the other. You don't want to cross-contaminate. And it's even better if you pick up your cold items last. So shop the middle and then go around the perimeter and pick up your eggs and dairy and meats last. So they are refrigerated or kept cold for as long as possible. When you get home, you want to store things ASAP. You don't want to get distracted. If you have a long drive from the grocery store, you want to bring a cooler most likely. But you want to put things in the fridge and the freezer as soon as you get home. You don't want to put things like eggs and milk in the doors of the fridge because that makes it more sensitive to temperature changes. You want to put those in the middle of the fridge. You don't want to leave things out for about more than an hour. That's a good rule of thumb. It's probably helpful to get a thermometer to put in your refrigerator to make sure that it is keeping things cold. 33 to 40 degrees is ideal, and you don't know that unless maybe it has something built in or you put in a thermometer. It's important the way you store things in the fridge. So I put this photo here to show you kind of the order from low to high. You want to keep your whole cuts of poultry on the bottom, and then you want to put your ground meats above that. Then you put your eggs and your whole cuts of other meat that are non-poultry. Above that, you're going to put the fruit and vegetable that you're going to cook. And then up at the very top, you're gonna put your non-cooked items. So the fruit and veggies you're gonna eat raw, or your things that are already cooked, like you see in the photo, like a cake or a dessert, maybe. That's to keep things from dripping on one another. So you don't want raw whole cuts of poultry dripping on your baby carrots that you're going to eat raw. So the order really matters. So when you're ready to prepare your food, there's quite a lot to think about to keep everything safe. Proper hand washing is one of the most important things you can do in all aspects of food safety. And I say proper hand washing because it's not just a little soap, a little rub, and a little wash. Like there's more to it than that. So there's an infographic here I put on. There are actually steps to properly washing your hands. You get a really good lather. You wash all aspects in between your fingers. You lace them like this to get the back of your fingers. It's a process. So if you've never really learned how to properly wash your hands, I would recommend YouTubing it. Watch a video. Happy birthday, you sing the happy birthday song 2 times. That's the length of time it should take you to wash your hands. And you definitely want to do that before you do your food prep, and maybe even during if you're switching from meat to veggies, and definitely before you sit down to eat. Your cutting boards are really important. So you want to toss any cutting board that's old, worn, has divots or knife marks in it. Bacteria really likes to get in those cracks or divots and stay there, and it's really hard to clean out. So if you buy new things in the kitchen, definitely spend your money on cutting boards and avoid the wood ones. You want plastic, glass, ceramic. You don't want wood. Wood really harbors bacteria. You want to wash your cutting boards before you use them, ideally. And it's nice to have different color cutting boards. So like the photo you see at the bottom, you only use your red cutting board for meat, and you only use your green cutting board for veggie. That way there's never any accident in kind of using the cutting board after you do meat for your veggies. Or it ensures that some of the bacteria may be left behind from the meat, even after washing, is not being put on veggies that are not going to be cooked. That cross-contamination can be really high risk. So it's even good to prepare your meats in one section of your kitchen and prepare your veggies in a separate section so that they're not close together. This photo is a bad example. So you never want to get your meat and your veggies that close together. You want to keep them far away on opposite sides of the kitchen if you're able. You want to wipe down surfaces really well, make sure things are clean, and avoid using the sponges. You want to use things like a cloth. You want to use maybe like the antibacterial wipes, the single-use things, instead of the sponges that can really harbor bacteria. Other preparation tips, you want to thoroughly rinse your fresh fruits and vegetables. You even want to thoroughly rinse your frozen fruits and vegetables just to be a little bit on the safe side. And I recommend getting one of the little scrubbers that you see in the photo here. You don't need anything fancy to wash your fruit and vegetables. Warm water is fine, but the scrub is really nice to help you get in the surfaces, in the crevices of what you're washing. Even if you have something that you're gonna cut and it has like a hard rind that you're not gonna eat, maybe like a cantaloupe, you still wanna wash the outside. That's because if you cut into it, it's gonna introduce that bacteria into the flesh that you'll end up eating. So even wash the rinds like a banana that you may not eat. That's important. you probably still want to wash your lettuce leaves that already say pre-washed. So just an extra layer of being diligent about that. And then the way you thaw your foods matters. So you don't want to thaw your foods on the countertop. You don't want to thaw them in the sink with running warm water on top. You want to ideally take them out of your freezer a day before and let them thaw in the fridge. So might require a little thinking ahead, but that's the best way to do it. Or you can use the defrost setting on your microwave, but you want to make sure you cook it right away after it's defrosted if you do it that way. So cooking our food safely, we want to make sure we cook things to the proper temperatures. So use the thermometer. I highly recommend you buy a food thermometer. You can do a simple one like the one on the left, or you can do a fancy one like the one on the right. But I would recommend, if you're not familiar with these temperatures, to print this out and put it on your fridge. My husband's always asking me what temperature. It's hard to remember. There's a lot. So you want to put your thermometer into the thickest part of the meat to get a reading, but you want to make sure things are cooked properly. And these are the temps that you want it to read. So after you've cooked, you want to make sure you eat safely. So hand washing again, don't share with other people. If you're questioning a leftover, throw it out. Don't risk it. Reheating is important for the meats you see below. Using your thermometer again, you want to get it to 165 for at least 15 seconds when you're reheating leftovers. About 2 days for leftovers is a good rule of thumb. And just think about this. You might be told not to eat out for about 100 days post-transplant. That's because of all the hands, all the exposure, all the poor hygiene risk. So you want to think about this before transplant so you can plan for it. What am I going to eat? Okay, so let's go through the different food groups quickly. It's important to note institutions are going to vary. The protocol I'm going to go through is from it's up to date on research. It's from a reputable institution and it's more food safety focused. If you feel you've been given a protocol that's really restrictive, I would encourage you to be your own best advocate and ask your team to explain the why behind the restrictions, especially if it comes to fruit or vegetable. Ask them to explain the science to you and what they're basing the restriction off of. Also note that you might have more restriction early on after transplant, and that restriction should ultimately be lifted over time. You should not be restricting fresh fruit or vegetable long-term, most likely. So for your carbohydrates, your starches, they're all pretty much fair game. The only thing to think about, or maybe not, most people don't use this, but would be the undercook or raw brewer's yeast. So that's on the left-hand side photo. Don't eat it out of the can. It also might come from, like, if you brew your own beer, maybe. Alcohol's another story after transplant. Or if you bake your own bread and it's not thoroughly cooked through. But everything else starch-wise is going to be okay. Your milk and dairy products, this is where you want it to be pasteurized. Most things are going to be good and fine to have as long as it's pasteurized. The way to know, you look where my red arrow is down at the ingredient list, and it should say the words pasteurized on the product. Some might blatantly say unpasteurized, some things. Most things are required to be pasteurized, but you always want to double check. Raw milk that you get from your neighbor farmer is not pasteurized. Things could be a little bit tricky when it comes to cheeses, so you definitely want to check for pasteurization there. And then avoid more of the moldy cheeses like gorgonzola, blue cheese, things like that. And don't eat the rinds. That's where a lot of mold is harbored. But other than that, pasteurized dairy products are going to mostly be fine. Eggs, again, pasteurized is the key here. All eggs, according to the USDA, are required to be pasteurized that are sold. The way you're going to get unpasteurized eggs are from your own chickens or your neighbor or farmer's friend's chickens. So anything you buy at the grocery store should be pasteurized, and pasteurized eggs can even be eaten runny. You want to avoid raw eggs. So if you're making like a Caesar dressing that requires a raw egg, your dressing's not going to be cooked, then you're going to want to avoid that. But everything else egg-wise should be fine. Your fruit and veggies, so as long as you're washing them well, then they're mostly going to be fine. You want to avoid the things that have the cuts, bruises, definitely mold. So your cooked canned fruit and veggies are going to be okay. If you're frozen fruit or veggie, you're going to want to rinse them just as you would if it was fresh. You want to choose the pasteurized fruit and veggie juices here. The things you might want to watch out for that I have listed on the avoid section, and this is controversial, would be the fruit and veggie that are hard to get your scrubber into. They're hard to clean thoroughly. That would be things with crevices like your blackberries or the florets of your broccoli, cauliflower. If you don't feel you can clean those well, then those would be probably the only fruit or veggie that's fresh or raw that you would want to avoid. But if you're cooking, let's say your broccoli, then it's going to be fine. You want to wash it as best you can and then move forward with cooking it. You want to avoid those pre-cut fruit and veggies, even like the pico in the container that the grocery store makes, the guacamole that the grocery store makes. You're avoiding those because it's been exposed to more people, not because it naturally is bad. Sprouts are probably something you should avoid. They're really risky when it comes to foodborne illness, neutropenia or not, and you want to avoid those salads from the salad bar. Drinks, when it comes to your water, it depends on your water supply. So if you have a city water supply, it's going to be fine. If it comes from a private well or community well, you want to make sure that water is tested daily. If it's not, then you're going to need to boil it. If you're buying bottled water, that's going to be fine. When it comes to your coffee and tea, if it's hot brewed, then it's going to be fine. That hot temperature is important for getting rid of the bacteria. Cold brew is going to be another story. So you really want to avoid the cold brew tea, sun tea, and then the coffee and tea that you get out like Starbucks and things, because we don't know how long that's been stored, and how many hands and what type of hands have been preparing it. Commercially made drinks that are pasteurized, like your non-dairy milks, are going to be fine. And then certainly things like Ensure Boost, which you may be drinking to help with your nutrition if you're not eating well, are certainly going to be fine too. When it comes to your nuts, factory packaged roasted nuts are fine. Factory packaged raw nuts are fine if they're pasteurized. If you'll notice the picture on the bottom left, you see your raw almonds. It explicitly says unpasteurized on there, so you would not want to choose that one. If nuts are in baked goods, that's fine. And then your jars of peanut butter are fine. The things that you're going to want to avoid are, again, if you're getting them from the bulk section, if you're doing the grind your own nut butters, or if the packaging does not say pasteurized. Another thing to think about are nuts in the shell. So you want to avoid those because bacteria can be on the shell. You're not cleaning the shell properly. And when you eat the inside, you're breaking it and kind of introducing the bacteria that way. Miscellaneous stuff, I'll talk about what to avoid. So unpasteurized honey, freshly ground pepper if you are eating in a restaurant. If you are eating in a restaurant, you want to buy you want the packets of condiments. You don't want the shared table ketchup. You want your own little packets. You want to think about like bottled versus freshly prepared dressings, because those dressings generally have raw egg in them. So you'll probably want to ask. And then definitely when it comes to nutritional supplements, you really want to talk with your healthcare team before taking those. So in addition to food safety, there are other things to think about when it comes to your nutrition. So I don't want you to fall for anything gimmicky. There's nothing out there. There's no one food that you can eat that's magic to help rebound your neutrophil count. People will try to sell you gimmicky things, so don't fall into that trap. What's most important for reducing infection and recovering neutrophils is to eat enough. Get enough nutrition in, eat enough calories, and eat a balanced plate like you see on the right. You want your fruits and vegetables, you want carbohydrate, you want plenty of protein after transplant. It's really important. Protein plays a huge role in immunity and fighting off infection, so you definitely want to make sure you're getting high quality protein, hopefully every time you eat. Use food to your advantage and helping you to mitigate some of the GI side effects you may be experiencing. There's a lot food-wise can do to help you. For example, if you're dealing with nausea, ginger is a great way to help subside that. So use food to your advantage when you can. Focus on folate and B12. So these are vitamins that are helpful when it comes to our blood cells. So you want to make sure you're eating a fair amount of that. Eat colors. Colors help us heal. So eat the rainbow when it comes to our produce and different food choices. And definitely I recommend working with a registered dietitian. This is a lot of information to take on and do on your own. A lot of transplant centers have dietitians available to you, and I really recommend you utilize that as a resource. Before you get too far in, learn up front so it feels less overwhelming. So definitely have a dietitian on your team if you're able. So in summary, good nutrition is super important when it comes to transplant and recovery. Each institution is gonna approach a neutropenic diet differently. If you feel it's overly restrictive, ask. Most institutions have not updated their policies to be more with the current research that we have. Neutropenic diet's not scientifically proven for anyone. It's never been shown to be beneficial when compared to other diets. Food safety and food storage practice are the most important things you can do to reduce your risk of infection from foods. I hope you don't feel restricted. I hope you feel you can eat most foods. It's just a matter of which foods in that category you choose. Not all dairy is out, but unpasteurized dairy is. So you can still incorporate this into your eating plan. And work with a dietitian. Always plug for that. No, you're fine. That's all I have. I know I ran out late. I know Audrey knows I do that. So any questions?
No, it's okay. I think you had a lot of information to share, and I think the information is really important to share. So you're good. We have a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to start reading them off to you. There's been some really good ones. Okay. So one of the questions was, how soon after transplant can they consume like fermented food, such as kimchi or sauerkraut or kombucha?
Ooh, yeah, so your institution might be strict on that, like right after transplant, but I have read hospitals providing that like right after transplant. Okay. That's controversial and it'll depend where you are, but there are institutions that do that right after.
Okay. Awesome. You touched on this a little bit. Talk about, you talked about the eggs that you get from your own chickens, but what about the food that you grow yourself in the garden? What's your advice there?
Yeah, so I'm guessing like when it comes to fresh fruit and vegetables that you're growing, maybe herbs, you want to make sure that they're washed really well. I would say that that's not necessarily something you should avoid if you grow it yourself. It comes, again, back to proper food safety practices when it comes to handling it and preparing it.
Okay, awesome. Why is yogurt okay in that list that you showed us?
Why is yogurt okay? So yogurt contains probiotics, which are good bacteria. And they can be extremely useful in the healing process. I would recommend the person that asked that question to like research a little bit the connection between like cancer patients eating probiotics, and you'll see some really good outcomes. So because it has the good bacteria in it, it's not necessarily a risk to consume.
Okay, great. As long as it's pasteurized.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
So then there was some questions about the hot tea with the loose leaf. What if it's brewed at like 220 degrees Fahrenheit? Is it still a no-go?
So if you're using the loose leaf tea, I would say no, because loose leaf tea is like one of your higher risk foods. It's kind of like I touched on sprouts. Like we have some foods that are really high risk. And so loose leaf tea really harbors bacteria really easily. So that would be one I would be a little bit more strict on and avoid the loose leaf and get more of like the processed like bags of tea.
Yeah, one of those that you'd rather be safe than sorry in that one. Okay. Exactly. Okay, we have several questions about like Brita pitchers or zero water pitchers. What do you recommend for filtering the water and making sure that it's appropriate to drink or use?
So if you're using like tap water from like a big city, like to put in the Brita, then I'd say that's going to be fine. But again, if you're using like well water that's like not tested through the Brita, I wouldn't do that without boiling it. I would still boil my water before drinking it in that case.
Yeah, I grew up on a farm, and so we had our little well, and sometimes like my mom would be like, "Don't drink the water," and I'm like, "Oh, I already did."
Yeah, pain to have to think about boiling everything, but I mean the alternative is buying like the bottled waters.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so does mayo in the jar have cooked eggs and pasteurized? How do you feel about mayo when it comes to cooking?
Mayo that you buy from the grocery store is going to be fine. Mayo that you make homemade with the raw eggs is not.
Okay, we talked about nutritional supplements. What about powdered super nutrition, that there are, like they give the example of organic superfoods. How do you feel about those?
Yeah, those are like from a food safety perspective, those are fine. They've been treated to where they're not going to be contaminated.
Okay, great. This is a great question, and I think we should hit on this a little more. When we're washing our fruits and vegetables, is it just water, or do you use vinegar? Do you use dishwash soap, which I know is a no, but
definitely not soap. You don't need that. I mean, that I think comes down to more preference. Like warm water is going to be fine. It's going to get the job done. But if you're one that wants to buy one of those veggie washes using vinegar, that's going to be fine too. I would say that one is personal preference, but you don't necessarily have to. Yeah,
that makes sense. Okay, you guys came up with awesome questions, and Katie, you cruised through those, so thank you. If there's any more questions, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat. We'll wait just one more minute. It's good to see so many of you too, by the way, familiar faces and new faces. Thanks for coming to our stem cell transplant chapter. I think we'll finish up. Thank you, Katie, for sharing this information. This was awesome. As a reminder, this recording and the slides will be sent to you hopefully tomorrow. If not, I promise to work on Saturday to get it to you, because I know a lot of you have said, I need this by this weekend, so we'll make sure to get it out to you. One last question. What about apple cider vinegar? Is that okay to be using?
Yes, if it's pasteurized. You want to double check.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, we're gonna finish out with just a couple slides. If you can stay, if not, you'll get it in the recording. So just to finish up, our next meeting will be on July 1st. We're gonna be getting the COVID-19 stem cell transplant experience, a patient and caregiver's perspective. Similar to the neutropenic diet that is prescribed by different institutions being different throughout the nation and especially throughout the globe, the COVID protocols that there are or aren't, don't have, I don't know how to put that in grammar. It differs for every institution, but we wanted to give you one perspective of what it might be like since hospitals seem to still have very strict COVID guidelines. We wanted to share that experience with you. So we have a patient and her caregiver coming to speak to us on July 1st. We also have other upcoming events. One that I'll hit on is tonight is the Myeloma Caregiver Chapter. I'd love to see you there. It's going to be a real interactive discussion talking about how we can prevent caregiver health decline, which is super important. And then we have our newly diagnosed chapter about why you need a specialist. Katie's joining us again on the 22nd to talk about smart snacking, how to choose a satisfying snack and kind of avoid that stress eating. And then the 24th, we have our African American myeloma chapter where we will be talking about getting a myeloma coach. African American coaches are really needed right now, and we're excited to talk about that with that group. We would like to thank our sponsors one more time: Bristol Myers Squibb, Amgen Oncology, Karyopharm Therapeutics, AbbVie Adaptive Biotechnologies, Genentech Oncopeptides, Takeda Oncology, and thank you to each of you for helping us build this strong myeloma crowd community. We couldn't do it without you. We appreciate you and hope you have a great rest of your day. So thanks for joining us, and thanks again, Katie, for being here.
Bye.